Global warming is the mother of all environmental issues.
We have one planet, and we need to keep it livable.
The link between quality of life and the environment is very profound.
We work for human rights, we work for children's rights, for women's rights, we work on an agenda of sustainable development, and well, climate change really brings all those agendas together.
It affects us from an economic security standpoint, it affects us from a public health standpoint, and it affects us from just a quality of life standpoint.
My 3-year-old daughter came down with what seemed like an innocent cold, and then she had labored breathing. I remember putting my hand on her heart, and her heart was pounding, and we went to the pediatrician. And the next thing we knew, we were being rushed to the emergency room. There's certainly evidence that suggests that climate change is linked to the epidemic levels of childhood asthma.
So we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and give ourselves a chance to adapt and develop the technology that we need to get there.
So the things I worry about are the rapid loss of biodiversity and the fact that my kids won't be able to see some of the same wildlife that I grew up being able to see.
One can actually see the effects of climate change.
Think about the mountain pine beetle infested forests of the West. I mean, I grew up when they were green and now they're red.
Ecology and economics come from the same root word, which is ecos, which means home. Economics is the efficient management of our home. And we've done a terrible job.
Historically, when people think about climate change, they think it's only going to impact us in the future, or it's going to impact people far away, or it's only about the polar bears. And the reality is, what's salient to people is things that are happening in their own neighborhood.
I came home one night, I was putting my kids to bed, and my 7-year-old at the time was in bed crying. Mama, the polar bears are drowning. And he was sobbing. It was just so heartbreaking. And I just cried with him because a lot of people don't want to hear about the polar bears, but my kids really care about everything that's happening to the planet.
Our future is maybe not what we always imagined it would be, and it might not become what we want it to be really quickly, but also that we have the power to do something about it.
We really do, leave a legacy behind and a country, and an earth, and a planet behind for our family.
We're running out of time.
Let's make
global warming.
Global warming.
Global warming history.
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 Let's make global warming history.
Let's make global warming history.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ann McCabe and Bob Perciasepi.
Welcome to the 7th Annual Climate Leadership Conference, co-hosted by the Climate Registry and the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. We have over 400 registered. That's more than we had in Chicago last March, so congratulations. It's a great time to see old friends, meet new ones, hear about best practices, do networking. I'm the interim executive director of the Climate Registry. The Climate Registry was formed 10 years ago by states and provinces and territories to enable a high-quality, credible way to report, track, and verify greenhouse gas emissions, which is done through our reporting platform. The Climate Registry also takes a delegation of states to the climate conference, the COP. Every year, we've been doing that 10 years with the Climate Action Reserve and Georgetown Climate Center. We're working on a National Energy Efficiency Registry and Water Energy Greenhouse Gas Nexus Registry. And you can find more on our website. I want to recognize all the folks who've been working for over a year on this conference at the Climate Registry and C2ES. If you would stand, staff that's been working on this, and be recognized. They have blue host tags, so you can find them. If you have any questions, just track down someone with a blue host tag.
They're apparently hiding right now.
Yeah. So, thanks.
Thanks, Ann. Well, we really do want to make sure you connect with the staff who's working so hard on this. This is the 7th Climate Leadership Conference, and we are just thrilled that we were able to continue this conference, and that happened in no small part due to the assistance and help from Bloomberg Philanthropies and America's Pledge, and I really want to thank them for their support this year. You know, this conference is about how businesses and cities and states can work together, and it always has been, and it's more important now than ever. Those of you who may not be familiar with C2ES, you know, we're a nonpartisan think tank. We bring diverse interests together. We're a top-ranked think tank in the world, and we enjoy working with businesses, cities, and states, and when we can, the federal government. You know, Bloomberg Philanthropies and America's Pledge are also showing that all of these groups can work together and make progress even when we are in danger of potentially going backwards. So one of the great themes today is what is going on and how much is going on and how important it is that we build the connections between all of you. We know that action's needed, and you're going to hear some of that during the course of the day as well, about how the weather is changing and how more intense rainstorms, fires. You just saw a picture of beetles and what they're doing to forests in the West. Just in January last month, it was actually colder in Jacksonville, Florida, than it was in Anchorage, Alaska, on the same day. These are real impacts that are starting to happen. And the business community is taking notice of this. The business community is looking not just at the risks that they face, but also the opportunities that they face. And that's the key. There are risks that have to be dealt with, but there's also huge opportunities in conquering these problems. So I want to thank Ann and the Climate Registry staff and everyone else who's worked on this. And thank you all for coming, because I hope you will leave here having shared, having learned, and having grown. So thank you for coming, and we're looking forward to a great conference.
Our first keynote speaker is Carl Pope, Vice Chairman of America's Pledge. He's an author and the former Executive Director and Chairman of the Sierra Club. Carl Pope is a veteran leader in the environmental movement. He was with the Sierra Club 40 years, 18 of those as the senior executive. As Vice Chair of America's Pledge, he has helped us with our keynote sponsor. He's a principal advisor at Inside Straight Strategies, looking for the underlying economics that links sustainability and economic development. He serves as a senior climate advisor to former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg, with whom he has co-authored a bestseller, Climate of Hope, and there will be copies available for signature after the lunch. Carl.
Thank you very much, and it is wonderful to be here. And I'm going to do something a little unusual. It's always a problem when you speak to an audience of the caliber of the folks in this room. You want to thank people, but if you start thanking people, it gets to be tricky, because you never quite thank all the people who you wanted to thank and who deserve to be thanked. So I have a privilege today. I get to thank a group of people who are not in the room. Or if they are in the room, they're not going to reveal that they're in the room because they're not allowed to be in this room. When I began work as a practicing environmentalist, the very month that I began work, President Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency. And I want to thank, on behalf of all of us, on behalf of all of the citizens of the United States, and in fact of the world, the men and women who have labored as the career servants of the Environmental Protection Agency and of the Earth's future for the last 48 years. They have done an astonishing job. Let's hear it for them. And let's hope that by next year, some degree of common sense has prevailed and they will be allowed to be in this room. Let's talk about optimism. When Mike Bloomberg and I wrote our book, it was in galley when the November 2016 occurrence took place. And when a book is in galley, you can't change very many words without driving your publisher crazy. And we had not written the book as a blueprint for how to cope with the Trump administration. That was not anywhere in our crystal ball. So we looked at the landscape and we discussed what we were going to do. We changed a few words in the introductory chapter to acknowledge the fact that, while we hadn't anticipated it, we were now in a Trump administration. And we made one big change. We changed the title. The original title was overheated, and it was sort of an internal lecture from several participants in climate advocacy towards others. It was inwardly focused, and it was not upbeat. And we decided, after we looked at the election results, that we needed to rethink how we thought about this. And we needed to say, can we legitimately be optimistic, and can we give the book an optimistic title? And we looked at it, and I'm going to explain to you why we concluded that was legit. I will say that when the book was released, almost every interview that I did was about how can you be hopeful. In fact, I spent one entire interview with WNEW in New York where the host kept saying to me, but really, really, how can you be hopeful? Really, really. And I told him that the reason I was hopeful was because of the work being done by people like those of you in the room and your colleagues. The fact is, by the time Donald Trump was elected, it was clear that the United States was going to reduce its climate emissions faster than any other large economy in the world. By the time Donald Trump was elected president, Mike and I were confident that the forces in American society that had been unleashed, the entrepreneurship, the ingenuity, the market pressures, the regulatory structures, the institutional education, and the personal leadership, moral commitment of the leaders of hundreds and thousands of important American institutions were in place, were determined, in many cases for quite short-term selfish reasons, like profits, to move forward away from a carbon-based economy to a decarbonized world, and that there was actually nothing that the President of the United States could do to prevent that from happening. Well, so far, we look like pretty good prophets. The United States has continued to cut its carbon dioxide emissions. The pace of retirement of coal-fired power plants, which were the first substantial target of the climate movement, has accelerated. We're retiring coal plants now, since Trump became president, twice as fast as we were in the period before Donald Trump became president. If you look at the indicators from the automotive industry, every year when somebody comes out with their projections about how many electric cars they're going to be on the road in 2030, that number has increased. Everybody's numbers are different, but everybody's numbers for 2030 are getting bigger and bigger at a rate of about 20% a year. So every year, the inside experts predict that electrification is going to come to the vehicle sector 20% faster than they did the year before. If you look around the United States back in 2013, President Obama and then Energy Secretary Ernie Moniz proposed a clean power standard. Today's internally driven, bottom-line base American Electric Power Resources Management Plan is more aggressive than what Barack Obama and Ernie Moniz proposed they would like to do if they had a willing Congress back in 2011. In Europe, 30% of electricity currently comes from renewables. In the United Kingdom, it's 50% from low-carbon sources. The city of Shenzhen, China, has just finished rolling out 16,000 electric buses, a product that 5 years ago fundamentally did not exist. In 2015, only 0.6% of light-duty vehicle sales were electric. In 2016, that climbed to 0.9%. Last year, it was 1.3%. All of the evidence suggests that the world is moving very rapidly towards a low-carbon fuel future. BP this year said they estimate that the peak demand for oil will occur no later than 2040. Shell thinks it will be about 2030. And you can roll on with the examples. The fact is, a revolution is taking place. It is not fundamentally being driven just by concerns about climate. People hate asthma. People don't like importing foreign fuels. People don't like pollution in their drinking water. And by the way, people like cheaper. And at this point in most of the world, low-carbon energy solutions are already, on a deployment-forward basis, cheaper than continuing to do more of what we've done in the past. So I think the evidence, as of today, for optimism is very strong. Now, I'm going to make one caveat. None of us knows how the world system is going to behave. There could be some discontinuity in the rate at which an ice cap melts, or the ocean currents behave, or the weather patterns of the Indian monsoon change, that could have some devastating effects that is already baked in. We don't know that. But we also don't know whether a meteor is going to hit the planet. So I suggest that those things which might be unpredictably baked in, it's an existential threat. We have to live with it. But over the rest of the landscape, we have agency and we are making progress. And I'm now going to give you 3 ways that you can, going forward, test whether you should be optimistic about the pace at which we're doing. These are 3 tricks I use to get myself anchored in the numbers. First, look at the leading indicators. Fossil fuel consumption is a trailing indicator. It is the last thing that happens. By the time it happens, there are a whole series of decisions that have ensured that it will happen. It's not something that we get up in the morning and say, oh, I'm going to burn fossil fuels today. You get up in the morning, you drive to work, your thermostat turns on your furnace. But there are leading indicators, particularly in the supply chain. And here are a few leading indicators that I've noticed lately. People are disinvesting in the supply chain. The owner of CSX Railroads, the CEO of CSX Railroads, which is a coal-hauling railroad, has announced that he will not buy any more capital equipment to service the 57% of his revenue freight miles that come from coal. When a coal car on CSX breaks down, there will not be a new coal car to replace it. The number of engineers in a half dozen of the world's most innovative auto parts companies that used to work on improving the efficiency of internal combustion engines has dropped by 50% in the last 5 years. Those engineers are now working on the solar drivetrains for those same auto parts manufacturers. Those kinds of early indicators are going to tell you that, in fact, we're moving quickly. Second thing to look for, I'm going to call these disruptive prices, but it's when somebody tells you that the utterly implausible is the absolutely certain. So a few years ago, oil was selling for $100 a barrel. And the oil industry told us at the annual CIRA conference in Houston that $100 as a price for a barrel of oil was the new $20. And that everybody should just get used to it because that's what was going to happen. And in 2014, when that announcement was made, the oil industry was spending $500 billion a year, mostly trying to find new reserves of oil that would make money at $100 a barrel. At the same time, it was possible to know that that was not going to happen. Because if you took $100 barrel oil and you took the projections for what the oil industry said, how much of it they were planning to sell in a decade, and where they were going to sell it, which was places like India and Africa, and you then looked at the numbers, you concluded that by 2035, India would be spending 1/3 of its total GDP on imported oil. That was not going to happen. It simply wasn't possible. And the answer was, when you have those kinds of implausible price disruptions, what it means is a bunch of smart people are going to notice that and find a better way to do it. There will be innovation in that sector, and the incumbency will be toppled, however impervious it looks. And the final thing I want to ask you to do, so that you can measure, okay, I can do all this anecdotal stuff that Carl's suggesting, but how does it all add up? Look for the second derivative. Yes, note how much fossil fuel we're burning. That's an important thing to know. Yes, notice how much we did or did not reduce that level of consumption in the last year or the last 2 years. That's the first derivative. But then look at the second derivative. The second derivative is, how fast is the rate of change changing? And if you look at the second derivative for the last 5 years, you will see that in sector after sector, the pace of decarbonization is accelerating. We are way too heavily carbonized. We are not decarbonizing nearly fast enough, but we are accelerating the rate of decarbonization at a rate which, if you project it forward, will bring us within reach of some moderately, potentially okay climate outcomes. And the reason for that is actually moderately okay climate outcomes mean less carbon in the atmosphere than there is today. We already have too much carbon in the atmosphere. But if you look at the rate of change, by 2065, we have a reasonable shot at getting back maybe to 375 parts per million from 410, and then we can go back down to 350. So we can do this if we pay attention to acceleration, and if we understand that acceleration is the name of the game. That's what we need in our own individual roles to focus on. Whatever changes we are responsible for, whether they are our own household, influencing the school district where our kids go to school, getting our CEO to speed up the rate at which he turns over the capital stocks in your company that consume electricity and waste it. Whatever your role is, focus on the places where you can speed change up. That is the most important thing we need. And I'm going to suggest one final little tool we might use. Corporations have chief executive officers. They're way outrated. I was one, I can say that from my own experience. Corporations have chief financial officers. Good ones are unbelievably valuable. Bad ones will kill an enterprise. Corporations have chief technology officers. They get to have a lot of fun because they're not really ultimately responsible for anything except frustrating people. Corporations now have chief sustainability officers. Many of you in this room may well be in a role somewhat like that. I'm going to suggest that institutions need chief optimism officers. They need people who will actually look at the world and say, wait a minute, here's a pathway to something we can really get behind. So with those tips, I'm going to let you shoot at me. I appreciate rude questions because they're much more enlightening. So now we're going to open up for questions. And I'm supposed to call on people, but I'm not sure I can actually see the hands very well, so that may be a challenge. I can't, I'm sorry. Oh, wait, Anybody have questions? Yes, all right, you're close, and then we'll go to you. Wait, you're going to get a mic, I believe. Isn't that how it is? Pause. And then if you get a mic, it's going to go over there next.
Hi, Richard Chorsky, Ziani Alliance. I really appreciate your remarks. A couple of questions on the strategies that you think are most efficacious going forward from a global perspective. And as you know, there's been a lot of attention on subnational strategies given the lack of ambition and the lack of legal mechanisms for Paris. I just wanted to get your sense of what you think the prospects are for more robust action through state, municipal, regional initiatives or other.
And business, to be blunt.
And business,
I think leaving aside the particular and hopefully temporary state we find ourselves in the United States today, it is a fundamental fact nation states are sluggish. Nation states were created to be sluggish. Their fundamental purpose is to defend an existing order. They're not innovative. Solving the climate problem and having sustainability on a host of other things and improving people's lives is all about innovation. Nation states will not and cannot lead. It's not just the United States. The innovation that's going to enable India to give 400 million people who currently cook on biomass and as a result are causing an extraordinary number of deaths every year and melting the Himalayan glaciers is not going to come from New Delhi. So I think bottom-up strategies for deep, profound structural reasons, not the short-term politics of the United States, but for deep structural reasons. Who's going to defend a national oil company? Barcelona? I don't think so. Iberdrola? Hardly. Who's going to defend a Spanish national oil company is Madrid. And that's going to be true in country after country. Nation states defend incumbency. Solving climate is about innovation, so the solutions have to come from the bottom up.
Hi, I'm Kathleen Hancock. I'm a professor at the Colorado School of Mines. And I had a question about natural gas. Since natural gas is playing a major role in our ability to come close to meeting the climate change agreements, how do you sort of square that? About 80% of our natural gas is fracked, and so that has a lot of negative environmental effects. But on the other hand, it's helping us put coal plants out of business. So I just wonder how you think about that and how we can think about natural gas going forward.
That's a very good question. First, I want to put one issue aside. Fracking is not the issue. The fact that we have a conversation about fracking is the result of the corrupted state of our political dialogue. Both sides know that it is not fracking that is the issue. If we were suddenly to produce all that natural gas without fracking, the risks would go up and the opposition would go up. People are not really opposed to fracking, they're opposed to too much production or too much drilling. Natural gas could have been a useful transition fuel. And its usefulness would, if we had done this all right, would be running out about now because we're now able to move on to better things. We don't need natural gas anymore. But 20 years ago, natural gas could have been quite helpful. The natural gas industry, unfortunately, and I was at a conference in this state when this all began to happen back in 2005, made a choice, which was to put the culture of wildcatting above what the industry was technically capable of doing. Every natural gas significant producer knows how to produce gas at a much smaller environmental price and with much lower leaks than they do. They know how. They do it when they're forced to. Ted Turner had a fracked natural gas operation on his ranch in Texas, which if people went and saw it, they'd have been welcomed having fracking in their neighborhoods because you couldn't tell it was there at all because Ted Turner made the companies do it the way they knew how to do it. But the industry made a conscious choice that its culture of anybody can get in, you can come in with cheap operations, you can move fast, you can flare, that was allowed to actually, in many ways, ruin the potential of what could have been quite a useful technology. I will say, in passing, that's fundamentally the story of nuclear power. There was nothing particularly wrong with nuclear power. There was a lot wrong with the nuclear power industry and with the way it came out of the Defense Department. So one of the things we will need to make sure as we move forward is that as we find new technologies to replace the 20th century ones that are incumbent, that we make sure those new technologies perform at their optimum, that we don't allow people to make shortcuts and sacrifice quality for fattened profit lines. So we have to have oversight, and unfortunately natural gas, I think, is a good example of what happens when you don't. To give you a really tragic example. Roughly 1 billion people in the world cook on biomass. What they should be cooking on is natural gas liquids. The natural gas liquids they should be cooking on are being mined, being drilled. They're coming out of the ground in Africa. They're all being flared. Nobody is making Total or Shell or any of the multinational oil companies producing natural gas in Africa take the C5s and the C6s and the C7s that come out of those wells, put them in cylinders, and distribute them to villagers to cook on. That is the kind of thing we can't tolerate. Other questions? Yes. Is there somebody else so we can get a microphone moving around?
I'm with the city of Chula Vista, and I was wondering, as we kind of tighten up a lot of our own emissions, the issue of leakage is one that I think is a bigger issue from environmentally, but also economically. And I think it kind of feeds into the environment versus economic and putting American workers at disadvantage. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about ways to address or kind of limit that.
That's important, and I think it's a funny thing. It's been this long conversation. We had this theory that we were going to have a great gathering in Copenhagen, and the world was going to agree how many tons of carbon every nation got to put out, and we would all get, in effect, a tax bill. There would be a global tax bill that would say what we had to do to meet our obligations, and that did not happen. That was never very likely to happen, but it didn't happen, and we now know it's not going to happen. Ironically, it is the problem of leakage and the competitive impact of leakage, which you mentioned, that is likely to get us carbon pricing. Because it is simply a case that by far the easiest way for any country to ensure that its energy or carbon intensive sectors are not economically disadvantaged if they're trade exposed, and most manufacturing is trade exposed. The simplest way to do that is to do what an economist named William Nordhaus at Yale has suggested: create a climate club of countries that agree to have a carbon tax of whatever number. I mean, let's say $30 a ton, because that's plausible, not as high as it should be, but it would make a big difference, in fact. And then you say, okay, if we import steel from Korea and Korea doesn't have a $30 a ton carbon tax on its steel makers, we will collect that $30 and keep it. When that happens, Korea will have a $30 carbon tax. Everybody will collect their own taxes. And as a result, you will actually end up having a tremendous downward pressure on those remaining carbon emitters, and they're heavily concentrated in the industrial manufacturing sector. That's actually going to be probably the hardest nut to crack in terms of decarbonizing. So creating border adjustment mechanisms that simply say, we're taxing carbon for what we make, and if you don't tax what you make and you try to bring it into our jurisdiction, we're going to tax it for you. I've been told the time is up. I want to thank you all very much, and I want to thank you in particular for what you're going to do for the remaining 365 days between now and the next conference. Thank you very much.
I want to thank Carl for packing a lot in there for us to think about, and as a University of Chicago grad, I'm glad to hear there's hope for carbon pricing. A former colleague, Joshua Pell, who was chairman of the Colorado Public Utility Commission, once said, the national labs are underappreciated and underutilized. We're going to try to change that a bit today. We have Dr. Martin Keller, who is the director of the National Renewable Energy Lab, NREL, with us. He'll be our second keynote. He joined NREL in 2015. NREL is the Department of Energy's primary laboratory for energy and efficiency, renewable energy research and development. Prior to joining NREL, Dr. Keller was at the Oak Ridge National Lab, and there he was asked to lead a new effort where he was responsible for energy, biological, environmental research programs supported by DOE, EPA, and the National Institutes of Health. So with that great experience, he's going to share some of his thoughts with us. Dr. Keller.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I just want to show you a lot of slides today. I want to follow a little bit up on the first speaker, where I want to share a little bit of the optimism. Also, this said, we have a lot of things to do. So what I hope what you will take away from this or from this little presentation is three things. Number one, we came a long way. Number two, we have to continue to do innovation. And number three, we have to do a better job to take technology with industry into the marketplace. So that's the three high levels. So let's start and dive into this, what I want to show you. First of all, NREL. So we are 40 years old, and it's a National Renewable Energy Laboratory down in Golden, Colorado. We have about 1,700 researchers, a lot of early staff. So we've done this kind of research for a long time now, for 40 years. When you look back, it all started out, and I will talk about this when solar and all this was not even on the block to even be talked at. So we're having a lot of portfolios in renewable power, sustainable transportation, energy efficiency, and energy systems integration. So we look basically at all the research and innovation in the space of what I would call advanced energy technologies in this area. So one level also what I'm trying to take away from for you is that we as a laboratory, we have two major pillars. One is to be excellence in the science and engineering in creating this innovation. And the second part is, what you're seeing also here is that we're creating innovations and that we're working with industry to deploy and bring this technology into the marketplace. And for us, we feel that this is extremely important, and I want to highlight two very forward-leaning areas where we're trying to do a better job in taking the technology and bring it into the marketplace. So first of all is a shout out to what you're doing with the Wells Fargo Foundation. So this is a new incubator program now, $30 million, where we're going out and teaming with Wells Fargo Foundation to bring in new companies in this space to our laboratory. We help to develop this technology to the next level, and then the startup companies have the opportunity to then deploy their technology into the Wells Fargo branches. So this is extremely successful. So our success rate is about 1 out of 3 companies we're supporting right now. And I feel that this is a very new way to drive this innovation incubator system forward. At this time, also I want to shout out, so we're having an industry growth forum here in Denver, May 3rd to 4th. So there's a couple of NREL people here, so if you want to learn more about this growth forum, please reach out to some of our folks. So the other important thing is we're seeing an increase of companies who actually want to work with us and even co-locate with us. So the first example there is Eaton Corporation. They're putting now 15 members of their company and co-locate them at NREL, that they're working hand in hand with their scientists and engineers to accelerate some of this technology and help to bring it into the market. So we're working there on microgrids, energy storage, and grid intelligence. And there's more and more interest to see, hey, can we bring this together with a national laboratory to expedite the technology transfer to industry? And then a lot of people, you might not know this, we're working with over 90 different nations across the globe in this area. So when we travel around, we're getting a really good sense what's actually happening in the world in the advanced energy technology side and market. So now let's get started. Where are we and where do we need to go? So this is, when it all started after the gasoline crisis, where the president this time said, well, let's create something new. Let's bring all these people together. Let's start some research activities in this, at this time, renewable energy field. So then we did a lot of work in trying to improve solar. And I always say at this time, people say, there's this couple of crazy scientists on the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, and they think that solar one day will have an impact to create energy. And then everybody had a little giggling and was laughing and said, this will never happen anyway. So this is how it started. So the question is, what happened over the last 40 years? So where are we going with this? So the first really interesting thing is when you look on a global perspective in solar generation. Solar is taking off like logarithmic right now. This curve shows you the growth, and again, this goes to 2015, and when you see from 2010 to 2015, it's almost logarithmic growth. So this is a really good sign. When you also then translate this, what does this mean? Because a lot of times we don't know what these numbers mean. So we made this very simple calculations that how much nuclear power reactors would this be on a global scale? So 2016, so about 75 gigawatts of new photovoltaic panels were installed. That's a conservative calculation, but it's about 16 average-sized nuclear reactors, which we deployed in 1 year in solar on a global scale. I think that's pretty cool, so that's very good. But the question is this good enough? We come back to this in a second. So what triggered these big changes? It's very simple. It's a decrease in cost for this technology. When you look at this slide, it shows you how land-based wind came down 41%. This goes all back to 2008. Distributed PV, 54%. Utility-scale PV, 64%. Modern battery cost, 73%. LED bulbs, you all know the story, 94%. And this trend is continuing to come down. So it's very simple that we're seeing a lot of kind of deployment in this because the cost is now competitive. And this is also seen on this slide here. When you compare the range for fossil fuel, and then you bring in biomass and geothermal and hydro and solar and concentrated solar power, and even now this curve is now really moving to the left as well, offshore wind, onshore wind, you're seeing that these costs are very competitive. In many cases, they're even cheaper than fossil fuel plants. And that's why we're seeing more and more type of this installation going deployed. You're also seeing this, how in the US the power system changes, and to follow up a little bit what we've heard earlier. Since 2005, coal came down 38%. Natural gas was going up 78%. You're seeing this on this blue line. But then you also, non-hydro renewable energy was increasing by 316%. And when you now go to the data of 16 and 17, this curve is really continually going up. So you also see that coal continue to come down. Why is it coming down? Very simple. It's a cost issue. So these new technologies are just cheaper than coal. So now, is this enough? Can we all declare victory and say, well, we're all excited and say we are optimistic? Yes, I'm personally very optimistic. This said, there's a lot of work we still have to do. And this is what I'm trying to show you a little bit in this next couple of slides. So let's assume we want to go to 10 terawatts by 2030, or 50% of the world electricity generations. So some people talk about this. If you really want to take climate serious, we need to really take this technology up and move this fast into the market. So what would this mean? There's a couple of studies out there, scenario plannings, and when you say we would go to 10 terawatts by 2030, and you're seeing this on the screen curve, there's a very simple problem. We could not even produce the solar panels fast enough. We cannot make them. So we cannot make them at the speed to be impactful by 2030. So this is a problem. So how do we address this problem? And this is where innovation comes in. So there is some new molecules now getting researched on, and we're having a very large program in this one, where you ask, okay, what is the next generation of materials for solar technology? Some of this is the so-called perovskites, and you're seeing this all the way in the right side. This is some cost estimates that these new materials can really decrease the cost of solar panels in the future. Why? First of all, the material is cheaper. And second one, what this is, and you might have heard about this is the so-called solar inks. So you can use technology like you're bringing this down onto a thin film, very similar the way you're making newspapers, the very same process. So you spread a very thin film down on a carrier, and this is changing the way we're manufacturing these solar panels in the future. And I want to give you a little bit of comparison in a study. So what we have done there is, if now we're making these very large panels where we're just rolling out this ink, very similar to, again, what I said, you make newspapers. So when you go, let's say you want to go to 25 terawatts of solar power, with these new technologies, and we used to say, okay, what about the surface, the 5 most distributed newspapers created in the US right now? And then we use the same surface and say, okay, what about if they would use this to print solar panels? We could produce 25 terawatts of solar panels in 3 years. With current technology right now, with the current capacity we have, it would take 170 years. And if we would assume the growth, what we're seeing right now, of about 20% annually in manufacturing capacity in solar, it still would take about 35 years. So this is what we're saying, this could be a game changer. It can revolutionize using solar in the future. It will be very cheap. We can use it in every different locations. And this is the only way, in my opinion, that we can reach this tremendous amount of electricity by solar in a very short time period, which I think we need to keep our environmental changes under control. So now let's go over and talk about wind. So a lot of people say, wind is all done. We know it's grid parity. We can't just walk away from innovation. We don't need this anymore. We are seeing that wind is tremendously successful. I mean, we have over 100,000 people working in wind. Wind technicians is the fastest growing profession in the US right now. So it's a very good success story. But we have to continue to drive innovation. Also, when you look at the states here, there's a lot of states now who are making more than 20% of the electricity. So it's Iowa, South Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma, North Dakota. It's all in this middle of the US. So, and I will show you why this is the case. I mean, this is where the wind is. So it's also very interesting that 99% of all wind turbines are located in rural America. So a lot of farming communities actually like this because they can mow around or plant around the wind machines, and they're getting extra revenue by leasing off the land. So overall, I think for the US, it's a very big success story. But we feel that this is really not where we need to go. We have to scale this up. So what is the problem? So this shows you the wind map in the US. So the blue is when you go to a so-called 80-meter hub height. So this means how high our wind machines are. So this is where you would have wind machines which are economically feasible. You see the blue area. So now let's say go to 110-meter hub height. And you're seeing how this is really spreading out. So now what would happen if you go to 140-meter hub height? And this is what this shows you. You would have wind in all the 50 states. And specifically, you would have it in the southeast, which right now we don't have any wind because wind blows at a higher level. So then it would be say, well, it's very simple, just make them higher. Why we are not doing this? So I don't know if you guys know what the problem is. It's not necessarily a technological problem. It is a very simple problem. It's the problem of transportation. Because if we go to 140-meter hub heights, we cannot transport the wind blades or the towers on our roads or rails anymore. And this is a couple of pictures here. When you probably see in the current blades, they cannot make turns anymore. If you go higher, you see this is here on the left, you're seeing that the base of the blades wouldn't fit through any tunnels or bridges. We cannot put it on railroad cars anymore. So we are limited by the way to transport this kind of wind machines from the manufacturing to the site where we want to install it. That's why we're working on new innovation, which you can see up there. What about if we bring up new materials? What about if we make these machines on site? So what would it take to build it there? And so this is where we continue to drive innovation in this type of research areas. So now we talk about the tremendous increase in the deployment of renewable technologies, and this is now where the problems come in. So this shows you that with wind and solar, we're adding variability to the supply chains. We suddenly have steeper ramps, we have shorter peaks, we have low turndowns. This said, we need to have the ability of a power system to respond to change in demand and supply. We need to get smarter how we're dealing with our grid. So how do we do this? So suddenly when you look at the flexibility on this, you're seeing that there is the supply side flexibility and there's the demand side flexibility. And in the past, we never worried about this. But suddenly now from a grid, how you manage and regulate our grid, we need to worry about the supply side and the demand side. On both, you see storage. So this is why you're probably hearing this. There's a lot of discussions right now is that with increased deployment in renewables, we have to increase also our storage capabilities. This is why a lot of offers out there that you do solar with storage or wind with storage, exactly out of this problem. And then there's other areas on renewable forecasting, flexible generation, on the demand side, demand response. I mean, you've heard about this, that utilities might have an ability to change your water heater and then to regulate it a little bit. Smart loads. There's a lot of activity and research now developed in this area, how we can be smarter in managing our grid for the future. So storage. So now storage is a very interesting topic because it's not completely clear who owns storage from a research perspective here in the US. So what are the storage technologies? The left picture shows you a pumped hydro plant in Tennessee. And the right pictures you all have seen, this is just big banks of batteries. So where do we go with storage? It's not completely clear what the solution is. So first of all, you also have seen this, that the cell cost of lithium-ion is decreasing rapidly, faster than anybody has anticipated. So now 81% reduction right now in 2017, and the forecast is that this will fall even more. So, but then storage is the problem that there is no one storage technology which fills all the needs. And why is this? Because first of all, we're talking about the capacity, how much storage do we need? But then the second and more complicated area is that we need storage in seconds, in minutes, in hours. Well, people are talking about seasonal storage. And there's not one technology which bridges all these different requirements. Right now, you see the biggest bubble is batteries right now. But we feel that in the long run, this is probably not the ultimate storage system in the go at a large grid scale storage need we have in this country on a global scale. So what are the other opportunities? And this brings me to this, what we call hydrogen. It's a platform molecules. So the idea is, what if we have new technology to take electrons coming out, in this case, a wind, of solar, even perhaps nuclear or concentrated solar, and we shuttle these electrons in something else. Can the shuttle be into hydrogen? And then using hydrogen to go into different things. You can use it for storage, you can go into vehicles, you can go synthetic fuels, you can use it for upgrading of bio-oil, you can use it for ammonia production, and so on. You're seeing what I'm talking about. Suddenly you would diversify electrons. Because right now, if you have electrons, the only thing what you can do is you pump it into the grid. So what about if this is changing and you can go into something else, such as a platform molecule as hydrogen? The other important thing is also, and I come back to this one, around transportation. And a lot of people underestimate the challenges we have in transportation. And this is why we're doing a lot of research in this area. And you all have heard about this, that we're seeing this next big revolution in the, what we call electrical mobility. But a lot of people forget that this is just half of the issues we're dealing with. And this is, again, what I'm trying to show you in the next couple of slides. So there is the short-distance transportation, and then there's long-distance transportation. So long-distance, airplanes, ships, big heavy-duty trucks. When we talk about the electrification for our transportation, a lot of times we're talking about short-distance, light-duty vehicles. And I'm absolutely convinced we will electrify this and combine this with autonomous driving. This will go faster than anybody anticipates right now. This is like a tsunami coming towards us, and nobody will stop this. This will come. But now let's talk about long-distance trucks. This is a problem. And why is it a problem? Because just look at the energy density on the left side. Lithium-ion batteries are down here. And then when you look all the way up where the 12 is, this is where gasoline, diesel, and kerosene is. So it's very simple that our current fuels are pretty good. They have a huge energy density. And this is an issue. We're probably not likely flying a plane across the Atlantic on batteries. So, and this is now, coming back to climate, a major problem. So why is this a problem? This shows you some forecasting when you look into the CO2 emissions of our transportation. When you look at the green line, it shows that when we electrify 60% of our vehicle miles traveled, we're making tremendous progress. Even with medium-duty vehicles on the blue line, we're seeing this. But now look at the red line. So by our increase in the economy, we're increasing the need of heavy-duty vehicles, aviation, rail, and off-road. So we will predict that we increase the CO2 emissions. If we're not getting the red line under control, we will not keep 450 ppms. We will shoot far above this. This is why transportation right now is the next big challenge. Because we know we have a good plan on the electricity generation, but on transportation and industry, by the way, this is the two areas where this is a major challenge for us to come and where we need more innovation for the future. So what about this? What I told you, what about if you use hydrogen? So what about if you do the science and that we in the end can use the CO2 and we take cheap electrons? Some people predict that electricity might be too cheap to meter on our houses. So we might have a lot of electricity available. So what about if we take new technology and capture this and concentrate it and converting this into fuel chemicals, materials, and polymers? Again, this is where I think is the future. This is what we have to develop. Is we need to do the research to do this, and we have a long way to go. There's some current processes out there, but they're far too expensive right now. But we predict that there's a lot of research going in this area, which we have to do to keep some of the transportation in check. And then there's new approaches, and this is where I highlighted, now it's getting very geeky, but I just want to show you where the trend goes. This is a science paper we had just last year or a year before, where we're suddenly combining some of these new nanotechnologies with biology. So this was a kind of cadmium sulfide, kind of a material using in photosynthetic materials, and we combined this with an enzyme which reduced N2 to ammonia. So suddenly what we've shown that we can drive this reduction of N2 to ammonia with light coming out of our atmosphere. So this is very revolutionizing. This is where a lot of the research goes, that we're suddenly combining material science with biology, and we also see that this is the next big innovation where we have to invest to drive this forward. And then this is the next big problem. How do you go from where we are today right now on the energy systems integration? Maybe about 1 megawatt, and then we have to go to 1 gigawatt in cities. How do we do this? How do we pull all this together? How do we combine this with the electrical mobility? This is the large challenges we will face. So our cities very likely will look very differently in 50, 80 years. So, but how will they look like? How do we combine all this? What will electric mobility bring? We will lose millions of jobs through autonomous driving. There's a lot of challenges ahead of us, which I would summarize in coming back to our earlier speaker, where I think I'm very optimistic. But I tell you, I don't want to be too optimistic, because if we think we have all the technology right now to handle this problem, I would say we have to think again. I honestly think we do not have the technologies to do all this. We have made a lot of progress, but there's a lot of things we still have to do the research on to continue to drive this momentum. If we continue this, I think, especially here in the US, I think we are the most creative people. We are the world leader in innovation, and I hope that we continue this innovation, because through all my travel, when I'm around, when I was in India, they look at us and says, Martin, if the US is leaving the field of innovation, who will do this? And if it's only China, then this is a problem. We want to have a choice. And I think it's also important for US companies. If we not continue to drive the innovations, other countries will do this, and other companies will have their edge, and they will go into these markets. And we have to continue to drive this innovation forward, that we stay on the forefront of the research. And with this, I think I have some time for questions. So here's one, yeah, let's go.
Hi, Daniel Barillo here, PhD candidate at Arizona State University, studying climate change and grid reliability. And I question for you about batteries. I just heard recently that carbon nanotube batteries have been developed by the folks in Korea. Can you elaborate on that? Or do you know anything about that? Can you give us any insights into the alternative battery technologies to lithium ion and what that could potentially mean for solving some of the problems that you presented?
Yeah, so first of all, when you finish your PhD, send me your resume, because we need people very urgently. So first of all this. The second point is, look, there's a lot of battery technologies out there. I mean, it goes where it's from flow cell, from different, air batteries and so on. So look, I think in my view, it's not completely clear where we're going with this. I mean, look, there is a lot of the batteries are developed for transportations right now, and we're using a lot of some of the same architecture. I mean, what Tesla does, you all seen this. Now they're using the same concept to go to their power walls. We believe that this is probably not the best way of doing this, because the architecture can be very different. Transportation has a lot of requirement. You have the highest density at the smallest amount of space, because, I mean, you don't want to carry a big trailer with a battery in the back. So for grid storage, it's different, because a lot of times the space might not be the complete limitations like you have in transportation, which will enable you to go to new architectures. A lot of the research right now, and this is, again, we said nobody owns it. A lot of the battery research is funded right now out of the Vehicle Technology Program. And Office of Electricity has a very small research portfolio. But no agency really owns storage at a large scale, where we're looking beyond the traditional lithium batteries. So I think it's a very fascinating field where this is going. So look, I mean, and again, I cannot specifically talk about what Korea have done. When you read the paper, there are papers everywhere right now. And I think it's not, in our view, it's not completely clear where this field is going. But we need to do all this research for all the above. Yeah.
Frank Stern with Navigant Consulting. I was wondering if you could comment on the recent solar tariffs imposed by the Trump administration and what the effects will be. I know there's a lot of concern about that. Initially, it seems like the industry is adapting to it, particularly with automated factories. So, interested in your perspective.
Yeah, that's a little bit of a tricky question. So, look, again, I repeat what I'm hearing from industry. So I don't want to talk about against the administration. So what we're hearing from industry is that most people feel that the impact might not be so severe. So we're seeing a potential slowdown on certain areas. But when you look how the tariffs are structured, a lot of companies feel that they get through this. And when you then look, especially, let's say, in rooftop solars, where the biggest costs really some of the installations and also then some of the permitting. So the increase in the cost for the solar panels will not significantly change their market. That's what we're hearing from industry. So it's a little bit of a slowing it down, but at the end they feel they will be okay. So that's what we have heard. But other people, and then they see all these extremes where people feel it's all falling apart and other people feel, oh, we don't even worry about it. So I think it has to be seen what the impact will be. Yeah, but there's down here.
Hello, Claudine Schneider, and I know you can't say anything negative about the administration, so if anyone has any questions about the budget, I'll be happy to answer them for him. I have both a request and a question. My request is that you share with us here a summary of the study that NREL did with NOAA, looking at only wind and solar potential for the entire United States and the cost of that. So that's my request. And then my question is, have you shared our renewable energy potential with just the wind and solar? In other words, this study and the cost with the utility regulators as well as with the Governors Association and various mayors associations? Thank you.
Look, I mean, the two excellent questions. I mean, on this study, I would encourage everybody, if you look on our website, you can find the studies, because look, I don't have all the exact numbers out of my head. I just tell you that the potential, and this is where you're alluding to this, is tremendous. When you look at this, I always say, and normally I have this slide, when I ask you how much of the solar resources we have in the US, how much of this have we installed? It's about 0.0001%. So it's almost it's not even in a rounding error. On wind, so wind, the potential of wind we have right now is 10 times more than all the electricity we're producing in the US, even with the still smaller height of wind power. So there's a tremendous potential there. And I know that I met with some folks here. We're looking with some of the cities right now, and I want to shout out there what LA is doing, because that's very much on the forefront. Where we're trying to work together on this question. So how would you go to 100% renewable energy? So, but look, the point is, well, I say it's a little bit more complicated, because the point is what we're seeing, and this will be very interesting. When you look into the communities, you can, even with current technologies, there's a path to go to, it's 100% renewables. But then if you expand this, let's say whole California would do this. Right now, I see then this is where we still have some challenges. And again, the challenges, frankly, are coming back into storage, and especially there into seasonal storage. This is a major problem we have to address. And this is why it's getting really complicated, that we cannot alone just look into the electricity generation. We need to look at this holistically. And that's why we liking this idea so much about diversifying electrons. Because can you imagine that look, and we are not alone in the US. I mean, when you look at Germany as an example, they're having huge programs, what I call Power to X. And their problem is the following. In good days, when the wind blows in Germany in the north and sun in the south, they're already reaching over productions. So they have to coattail their renewables. So that means they're turning off a wind machine. So what if you let it run and just take all this and shuttle electrons to something else? So suddenly you might then using this to also produce fuels, but you also can use this then to go back to seasonal storage. So this is why we feel we need to look beyond the traditional way of how we handle the grid and also how we handle kind of electricity generation. We need to look at this much more holistic. And this is the reason why we have to integrate transportation into these discussions. So if all of us, or let's say all our children will have electric cars, what will this do to our grid? So this is something where we have to get our heads around this. And that's a lot of challenges in front of us. So can we take one more, or should we wrap it up? We wrap it up? Okay. Thank you, everybody. So please check out our website, and thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. Yeah. We'll hear more about transportation in several of this afternoon's panels. Just a quick rundown on this afternoon. First, when you're exiting, you can get a signed copy of Climate of Hope straight out there. Breakouts, the breakout sessions will start at 2, so get a quick hit of caffeine or chocolate. Head on in. The opening plenary is at 4. Back here, we'll hear from Catherine Hayhoe, Bridging the Gap Between Science and Stakeholders, a Denver Clean Energy Economy panel with Mayor Hancock and XL CEO David Eves, moderated by Bob Perciasepi. At 5:30 is the welcoming reception back out here. There's also, in the Aspen room, an attendee lounge where you can go this afternoon and tomorrow afternoon to work or to have meetings. And with that, happy short break and on to the breakouts. Thank you.
And you're not moving anywhere. You thought you found a friend to take you out of this place. Someone you could lend a hand in return.